Where are we now?
Look! See up there? That's the North Star. That's how we know where we are and where we're going.
Oh, freedom! Oh, freedom! Oh, freedom over me! And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave, and I go home to my Lord and be free. Yes, I'll be free.
Hello, I'm Fred Gregory, a former NASA astronaut. I've flown on 3 shuttle missions. Each of those journeys is an adventure I'll never forget. The purpose of this program is to tell you about a journey of a different kind. The journey of thousands of people who used the Underground Railroad throughout the 1800s to escape slavery in the United States. In addition, we'll tell you how the people who used the Underground Railroad accomplished what they did through the use of mathematics, astronomy, geography, and other sciences, just as NASA does today. We'll also touch on sciences such as horticulture and cartography, or map making. Just as other astronauts and I have had to learn a whole new set of skills that allow us to survive in space for days at a time, fugitive slaves also practiced their own survival skills. It was always my dream and the dream of NASA to experience the freedom of being in space, to explore space and all its frontiers. Those who escaped slavery in this country by using the Underground Railroad had their dreams too, to find their freedom in northern states and Canada where slavery did not exist. They did this by employing several methods. One was to follow the drinking gourd.
Slaves using the Underground Railroad relied on the science of astronomy, and specifically what they called the drinking gourd, to guide them to freedom in Canada. They were referring to the Big Dipper, which was considered the gourd. The stars at the wide part of the gourd, or the bowl of the Big Dipper, point to the North Star positioned at the end of the Little Dipper's handle. Those escaping slavery in the South diligently followed the drinking gourd and the North Star, which guided them to the north, into Canada, and to freedom.
Follow the drinking gourd, for the old man is a-waiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd.
John Freeman Walls dreamed of freedom since he was a boy. He was born to slaves in Rockingham County, North Carolina, in 1813 in a cabin on the property of Eli Walls. Shortly after John's birth, Eli's wife gave birth to their son Daniel. John and Daniel grew up together. They were like brothers. Eli was perceived as harsh and even cruel by those around him. But Daniel had a kind heart. Although he seemed to be following in his father's footsteps as a land and slave owner, he decried the evils of slavery. As a young adult, John's skill as a carpenter and manager earned him the job of running the Walls tobacco farm. Many slaves like John Walls possessed keen management skills, which enabled them to be entrusted in running their master's plantations. Slaves in management positions were also proficient in math, a valuable skill that helped them account for the work that was done daily.
It was John's father, Hannibal's own dreams of freedom, that planted the seeds of escape in his son's mind. Hannibal planned his escape to Canada via the Underground Railroad. As he left, his words of wisdom to 15-year-old John were,
"If you remember nothing else that I taught you, remember, the side of the tree the moss grows on and the North Star are the way to freedom. To the north, there's a place called Canada, which is a heaven of freedom, John, like my native Africa.
John was the slave of Eli and Daniel Walls in North Carolina. Jane was Daniel's wife. John and Daniel had grown up as boyhood friends, and on Daniel's deathbed he said, "John, take care of Jane and my 4 children." John and Jane, who was Irish and Scottish, they fell in love. Certainly the truth of the story is stranger than fiction, and they traveled on the Underground Railroad because it wasn't legal that black and white could marry in North Carolina.
Despite all the risks, John and Jane decided to commit to each other and escape north via the Underground Railroad.
The Underground Railroad was a secret complex network of free blacks, former slaves, and white American and Canadian abolitionists that were committed to freeing slaves and ending slavery in the United States. At its peak, the Underground Railroad was used roughly between 1820 and 1865, the year slavery was finally abolished. In that time, thousands and thousands of slaves became fugitives and made their escape from the slave-holding states. Many headed toward Canada, making their way on the Underground Railroad by the light of the North Star. To avoid slave catchers, they slept by day and traveled by night. The locations of the safe houses along the Underground Railroad were kept highly secret. The only people who knew about them were abolitionists and fugitive slaves. Safe houses provided a welcome respite for escaping slaves, a meal, perhaps a bath, and shelter in a barn or other hiding places.
My current project is historical retracing of the Underground Railroad and its many routes throughout the country. In researching the period of slavery, I came to find that there was very little written about the Underground Railroad, other than the people who were most prominent in the abolitionist movement and kind of the political end of what the Underground was about, all of which I try to link together by actually following the path that the slaves took to get from the southern states to the north.
Fugitive slaves used maps as well as geographical landmarks to guide them by day, and the North Star to guide them at night. Most traveled by foot. Occasionally, slaves were given rides in wagons with false bottoms. Some even shipped themselves to the free North or Canada in trunks, or escaped in trains.
I actually traveled the banks of the Tom Bigby River, which was one of the escape routes that was famed in the song "Follow the Drinking Gourd." And if slaves sung the words to that song, they were given instructions of following the Tom Bigby River between Mobile, Alabama, and the foothills of northern Alabama and Tennessee. There they would be led to the Tennessee River, which would then lead them north to the Ohio River, and then north into the Free States.
It was no accident that the Underground Railroad was routed near water as much as possible. Water waves proved to be faster when slaves could stow away on boats, rafts, and other watercraft. But when obstructed by bodies of water with no craft in sight, slaves had no choice but to make their way through the water as safely as possible. The risk of getting caught in water was great because bloodhounds' keen senses could pick up a slave's scent from skin cells left on the surface of the water. To keep from being apprehended or even killed, they also relied heavily on the science of geography for protection and sanctuary, actively seeking the natural protection afforded by the swamps, bayous, caves, and forests they found.
Today we are further investigating the history of the Underground Railroad in Mount Zion Cemetery in Washington, D.C. using the ground-penetrating radar unit known as SIR-8. We're searching for additional sites such as artifacts, campsites, burial grounds, and caves.
Start to run.
We're looking at a cross-section of the Earth. It's like you took a slice of the Earth and showed it sideways. Where we have a stoppage of the signal going down, we will have an anomaly showing as a peak. In here, we have a very large anomaly deep down below 6 feet. Underneath that is another anomaly that might be a burial underneath the first one.
This was a very important spot for the slaves because they could use it as a place to go and plan how they were going to escape. This is very exciting for young people that are here today because they not only learn about the history of the Underground Railroad, but they learn to use technology such as the ground radar detecting unit to help them further the research about the Underground Railroad.
The threat from animals was always present to slaves on the Underground Railroad, from those who shared the woods with them to the dogs slave catchers used to hunt them down. Slaves put turpentine on the bottom of their shoes to throw off the scent to the dogs that hunted them.
Probably the most dangerous part about traveling at night is dogs. When slaves escaped from the plantation, bloodhounds were often sent out to track them down. And at the time, they were referred to as Negro dogs, dogs that were specifically raised to hunt down fugitives.
When they traveled in groups, slaves also zigzagged across open spaces to mix their scent in an effort to confuse the animals.
Slaves couldn't always depend on safe houses for their meals, and they could carry only a limited amount of food with them while on the run.
One of the first things they had to deal with was what they would eat and what they would wear. Food was stashed away. Of course, that had to be carried. Carrying any large amounts of provisions slowed them down and actually lengthened the journey. So people would forage for food along the way, raid plantations and farms as they went.
To sustain them on their journey north to freedom, they often hunted, foraged, and pilfered from farms and gardens. Fugitive slaves heavily relied on available plant life along the Underground Railroad, not only for food, but for medicine too. Slaves brought with them to America a centuries-old knowledge of horticulture and herbal healing.
The African-American healing system was a very developed system that was handed down through herbalists from generation to generation. This was a system that identified the importance of the psychological aspects of healing as well as the physical aspects. Echinacea, for example, is a native plant to North America that stimulates the immune system. It was used in the root form in African American herbal healing. Artemisia was used to cure menstrual cramps. Mint is a garden plant that was used to solve indigestion. The plants that we see here are in a dormant stage or in their winter dried stage. Even though many of the slaves traveled during the winter months, the plants were still useful even in their dormant stage. A lot of the poultices that were used the dried flowers and the dried stem tissue, and teas were made from the roots that contain the active ingredients. It's amazing looking back 200 years ago what these supposedly uneducated people came up with as far as their herbal remedies. Now we're looking back and we're finding that a lot of our modern medicine may not be the long-term best road, and we're looking back to these herbal remedies because they contain a lot of the natural compounds that we can't replicate through our chemistry. Mother Nature has put them there for us.
The journey to freedom along the Underground Railroad was more often than not a perilous one. But one constant bright light never failed to remind them of their dream of freedom.
The hunted warriors now, slaves before, ran on through the night, with their heads looking up continually through the thick forest and leaves, searching frantically for that beacon of hope in the vast expanse of sky and space, the North Star.
Against all odds, in 1842, John Walls and Jane King eventually made their way through Kentucky to Indiana, a free state. Shortly after arriving in Indiana, John and Jane married.
The Underground Railroad was a loosely connected series of routes that were nonetheless intricate. Maps were made by former slaves, free blacks, and white abolitionists who used the science of geography to establish routes. There were 4 main routes mapped out that led to freedom. North along the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, west along the Gulf into Mexico, south into Florida, where fugitives sought refuge with the Seminole Indians, and along the eastern seaboard into Canada. To throw off slave catchers and bounty hunters who were on their trail, fugitive slaves used paths that zigzagged and doubled back. Although routes were carefully guarded secrets, they were passed along to those still enslaved in the South in a number of ingenious ways.
Maps of the Underground Railroad were smuggled into the South and relayed by several other methods, such as word of mouth, storytelling, and through song. Coded directions were contained within the contents of newspapers, letters, and other bulletins. Quilts made by slave seamstresses on the plantation also bore escape information.
Using quilts in the 19th century as a means of conveying messages was traditional to the American culture. Women used quilts as their way of expressing themselves. It was a billboard and cloth, if you will, for many in the 19th century. So therefore, for the African American community, for the enslaved Africans, to use the quilt as a means of communication was not as alien as some might think. The patterns were there as mnemonic devices. That is to say, the quilt patterns were there to trigger the memory of those who saw them. Apparently what was done was a sampler quilt of some kind was used to teach the code to those who were about to escape. The patterns and their meaning were individually memorized so that the escaping slaves could then take with them mentally a map. Quilts were hung on the fence, 1 quilt at a time, a total number of 10 quilts. The first quilt contained only the monkey wrench pattern. That was an indication for the people to gather whatever tools they needed for this journey. Once that quilt came down, the next quilt that went up was the pattern wagon wheel. This was to alert the slave community to put together whatever materials they would need to put into a wagon, things that one would take on a journey. And then the quilts went in sequence down until finally what was shown was the tumbling blocks. That pattern was to indicate the time had arrived. You were to box up, pack up, and leave. The map was in their head. People make the mistake of assuming that those who were brought here from Africa came without culture, without knowledge, without a wealth of information. And they're very wrong, because the people who came over brought with them their culture, centuries of knowledge of the stars, of growing crops, of doing many things, and above all, the use of mathematics. Mathematics are necessary. Mathematics is essential if you're going to create these quilt patterns. We're working in geometry.
People who helped along the Underground Railroad were known as conductors. They provided safe houses for fugitive slaves, as well as clothing, food, transportation, and direction to the next station. Conductors did what they did at great risk to themselves because it was illegal to harbor runaway slaves. Often conductors became just as hunted as the slaves themselves. What spurred them on, however, was their own passion for freedom.
Slaves had people who were there to assist them. Many slaves got out of bondage after meeting what were commonly known as abductors, people who would come into the South and make their way to a plantation and give slaves information, sometimes maps, sometimes weapons, even compasses.
In addition to maps and the dedicated anti-slavery society leading them to freedom in Canada, slave fugitives had another constant guide, the North Star, the Underground Railroad's powerful metaphor for freedom.
It was no accident that slaves using the Underground Railroad relied heavily on astronomy and the North Star to guide them to freedom. While the constellations constantly shift position in the nighttime sky, the North Star remains steadfast. Everything else revolves around it. The North Star is such a reliable guide that astronauts use it to align the onboard navigational systems on the Space Shuttle and the International Space Station.
All through history, the North Star has been one star that people have realized stands still. Every other star rises or sets in the sky or moves around some other way, but the North Star is one that's steady. So as people started moving away from familiar landmarks, they used that as a navigation tool. So if they were sailing away or even on land, as long as the North Star stayed at a certain height on the horizon, they knew they weren't going far south or north. But if they drifted and the North Star moved, they knew that they were moving north or south on the globe. So this particular part of the sky where the North Star and the Big Dipper are almost universal. Everybody in the Northern Hemisphere can see them at one time or another. So it's part of the sky that every culture has seen, and every culture is interpreted in their own special way. It's become animals or a story or an object, but it's something that people around the world have in common, the Big Dipper, the North Star, and that part of the sky. When people in Africa look toward the sky, they recognize stars like the North Star and the Big Dipper, and they realize that North Star is a steady star, and when they were stolen from their homes, brought to North America, these same stars are visible, and the skies are still dark. The North Star was there, the Big Dipper or the drinking gourd was in the sky, so they knew that they could use that star to go north, and they had heard that toward the north was freedom, to the northern free states and to Canada, and they could use that star to guide them to the northern part of the United States of Canada.
After 3 months in Indiana, John and Jane Walls arrived in Toledo, Ohio, closer to freedom than they had ever dreamed possible, but still a long, long way from safety.
I'm on my way to Canada, a free man's right to share the cruel wrongs of slavery I can no longer bear. My heart is crushed within me, so while I remain a slave, I am resolved to strike the blow for freedom or the grave. From Song of the Fugitive.
On a summer morning in 1845, John and Jane Walls sighted Amherstburg, Ontario, from the boat that carried them to freedom across Lake Erie and the Detroit River. The Walls settled in a town about 20 miles inland called Maidstone. Their home there became known to fugitives as a last stop on the Underground Railroad.
In Canada, John and Jane Walls were among the thousands whose quest for freedom made the Underground Railroad a success. And today, with the use of modern technology, we are exploring and preserving its history.
Today, advanced technologies are being used to preserve the Underground Railroad for generations to come. Geographical information and global positioning systems, aerial photography, and satellite imaging are being used to locate Underground Railroad sites and routes throughout the United States.
The Geographic Information System, or GIS, is really a combination of computer as a tool to do something we've been doing for many, many decades. Because for years we have taken maps of various areas and we've put overlays on those to show certain things, whether it's land use, land ownership, tax base. Now we put those into a computer. So the overlays are in the computer and we can turn them on or turn them off whenever we want to. This gives us a much greater analysis capability than we had when we were forced to work with the paper product. The GIS is really a storage medium, and we get a good deal of the data from remotely sensed devices. Some of these are cameras, some are satellite-borne sensors of different kinds.
The Landsat satellites acquire multispectral digital image data of the globe's land surfaces. The data are used by scientists and people who manage our land resources. Those exploring the history of the Underground Railroad could use Landsat data to visualize the terrain and the topography and the kinds of land over which the escaped slaves traveled during their escape.
Our electronic databases have broken down the individual stories into a variety of components, some of which are geographical, others of which are social. And the wonderful thing about geographic information systems technology is that it allows us to keep each of those categories intact, but then layer them such that we can look at the variety of categories in relation to one another without doing any damage, if you will, to the nature of that information. We can keep the information in the form that it is and mutually interpret it.
The National Park Service has a number of programs that speak to the various disciplines that are necessary for totally understanding and appreciating the story of the Underground Railroad. Through both our historians, archaeologists, through GIS, through our other sciences, we are beginning to put together a comprehensive record of not only place but routes and the conditions that existed during the period of the Underground Railroad movement.
Archaeology is another science being used to gather important information about the Underground Railroad.
We're just now opening up this site here at Adrian College, which is one that dates back to the times of the Underground Railroad. We're trying to discover whether or not there are actually some tunnels running from this building that we're currently in over to one of the present-day fraternity houses. Archaeology has a tremendous amount, really, to offer this study. The site that we're digging today is very exciting, I think, for the students because they're able to have a hands-on experience with archaeology. Today they'll be getting some experience with the tedium, quite frankly, of archaeology. Some of the time you brush and you dig and nothing comes out. Other times they'll find some things. Also, I think it just is a way of really having a sense of connection to that time. There's nothing like the thrill of finding an artifact that was once touched by someone who actually was in the underground or was perhaps an operator with the Underground Railroad. So I think these students take away today a tremendous learning experience.
Taking risks, charting new territory for the good of all mankind, promoting peace and freedom. The exciting journey to freedom by John and Jane Walls lives on today in the John Freeman Walls Historic Site in Ontario, Canada.
The Underground Railroad was the first great freedom movement in the Americas. It was the first time that good people, black and white, worked in harmony for freedom and for justice. We have much to be thankful for as descendants of fugitive slaves, and we know that they laid a foundation that we could build on, and that's what progress is all about.
Racial harmony begins when people become able to know each other better.
Most of the Walls' escape to freedom can be attributed to their tenacity, as well as the fearless dedication of those who helped them on the Underground Railroad. In part, the Walls and thousands of other fugitive slaves' success was based on the science that was used to guide them to new worlds.
So many things have changed since John and Jane Walls followed their dreams of freedom over hundreds of miles under perilous conditions. NASA, for one, has followed its dreams into space and beyond. One thing hasn't changed, however. Following your dreams is as constant as the North Star. And the proof is in new generations who are following their own dreams.
This is not an African American story. It is a story of liberation, and that all of us are part of that equation. And that's the legacy that must go forward if the Underground Railroad is to have true meaning.
Drinking gourd, follow the drinking gourd. The old man is a-waiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd.
The riverbank would make a mighty good road.
Dead trees will show you the way.
Left foot, peg foot, traveling on.
Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. For the old man is a-waiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd. A river ends between two hills.
So follow the drinking gourd.
There's another river on the other side.
Follow the drinking gourd.
Follow the drinking gourd. For the old man is a-waiting for